Everybody knows the story of Pearl Harbor, right? It's the ultimate symbol of a devastating surprise attack. But what if I told you that a couple of years later, the US delivered a blow that was, in many ways, its perfect mirror image? An attack so crushing, so complete, that it's been called Japan's Pearl Harbor. Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. The story of Operation Hailstone and the absolute annihilation of Truk Lagoon.
Just picture this. A massive, calm lagoon, the perfect natural harbor, sheltering the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Then, out of nowhere, just before dawn, the sky fills with American planes. The base is caught completely, totally off guard. What followed was a 48-hour storm of destruction that would erase one of Japan's most important strategic assets from the map. So, what exactly was this place? To understand the attack, you've got to understand what Truk Lagoon meant to the Japanese war effort. They called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and that's not an exaggeration. It was the absolute keystone of their entire Pacific defense. I mean, look where it is, right in the middle of the Caroline Islands. This was Japan's premier forward operating base. From here, they could project power all over the South Pacific. They could resupply all their scattered island garrisons, and, most importantly, they could protect the vital shipping lanes that were the lifeline back to Japan itself. Its location was everything. And when we say fortress, we mean a fortress. This wasn't just a quiet little anchorage. We're talking about a massive complex. It was home to the 4th Fleet. It had 5 separate airfields, a seaplane base, huge port facilities, you name it. And crucially, its air power was like a dagger pointed right at the American island-hopping campaign, making any advance through the Marshall Islands incredibly dangerous. So yeah, the Americans knew they couldn't just sail past this place and hope for the best. Truk had to be dealt with, and that set the stage for a huge operation, codenamed Hailstone. But here's the thing. As the Americans were laying their trap, the Japanese were starting to get a little nervous themselves. For the American commanders, the math was simple. You just couldn't make the next big jump to Eniwetok, let alone push towards Saipan in Japan, with this massive enemy base sitting on your flank, ready to cut you off. Truk didn't just have to be damaged, it had to be completely and utterly neutralized. But here's the twist. The Japanese weren't totally in the dark. In early February of '44, they spotted American recon planes buzzing overhead. The alarm bells started ringing. They realized their impenetrable fortress was about to be hit. And in a move that would prove incredibly fateful, they started quietly pulling out their biggest prizes: the heavy cruisers, the battleships, and the aircraft carriers of the combined fleet. But even with Japan's main battle fleet gone, just look at the mismatch of forces the U.S. brought to the fight. It's staggering. Task Force 58 shows up with 9 carriers and over 500 aircraft plus battleships. What was left to Truk to defend? A handful of warships, a ton of vital but totally vulnerable merchant ships, and about 350 planes. And get this, only about half of those planes were even in flying condition. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. And so, on the morning of February 17th, the storm finally broke. Operation Hailstone was a go. And for the Japanese forces at Truk, it was a complete and total shock. It was Pearl Harbor all over again, but this time the stars and stripes were on the wings of the planes. The Americans executed this perfectly. The first wave launched in the dark, 90 minutes before dawn. So how did they get the drop on them so completely? Well, you're not going to believe this. After weeks of being on high alert, the Japanese had relaxed, and their air patrols were actually on shore leave. On top of that, their radar was basically useless against the low-flying American planes. It was the absolute perfect storm of unpreparedness meeting overwhelming force. As the Japanese pilots scrambled their famous Zeros to meet the attack, they flew straight into a buzzsaw. The American F-6F Hellcats were waiting for them, and they were faster, tougher, and better armed. In those first few chaotic minutes, 30 of the 80 Zeros that got into the air were shot down. The fight for control of the sky was over almost before it even began. And once that aerial shield was shattered, well, the real prize, all those ships sitting in the lagoon, became a giant shooting gallery. We're talking about more than 50 merchant ships, packed to the gills with ammo, supplies, and spare parts for the entire Pacific theater. And now they were just sitting ducks for the American torpedo and dive bombers circling overhead. This led to one of the most jaw-dropping moments of the war. A torpedo bomber from the USS Intrepid put a torpedo right into the ammunition ship Ikoko Maru. The explosion was so enormous, so cataclysmic, that the 10,000-ton ship was literally vaporized. The blast was seen and felt for miles around. Just gone in an instant. And the whole attack was just brilliantly coordinated. You had the carrier planes causing absolute mayhem inside the lagoon, while Admiral Spruance himself took a fleet of battleships and cruisers and circled around to block the only deepwater exit. The trap was sprung. There was no escape by air and no escape by sea. For the next 2 days, the Americans just systematically took Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific apart, piece by piece. And when the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the destruction was, well, it was almost unbelievable. Let's just look at the final scorecard, because the numbers tell a brutal story. The U.S. lost 40 men and 25 planes. In return, they killed over 4,500 Japanese personnel, destroyed more than 250 aircraft, sank 6 warships, and sent a staggering 32 merchant ships to the bottom. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. 200,000 tons. It's a massive number, but what does it really mean? It means Japan lost an incredible amount of its logistical capacity in one go. At this point in the war, their industry just could not replace these ships, especially the fleet oilers, the floating gas stations that their navy desperately needed to operate. And it gets worse. It wasn't just the ships. It was what was in them and at the base. 17,000 tons of fuel went up in smoke. This loss was a strategic catastrophe. It crippled the Japanese Navy's reach, and you can draw a direct line from this fuel shortage to their reduced effectiveness months later at the huge Battle of Leyte Gulf. And this right here is where the Pearl Harbor comparison becomes so powerful, so complete. Yeah, Japan's main carriers had escaped, but the raid on Truk achieved the exact same strategic result. It paralyzed the enemy's fleet. See, it didn't just sink warships, it destroyed the entire logistical backbone, the supply ships, the repair yards, the fuel, that allowed the Japanese Navy to project its power. Operation Hailstone wasn't just another battle. It fundamentally changed the strategic map of the Pacific, and its legacy is still with us today, in a very, very different form. The strategic dominoes just started to fall after this. Truk was now totally cut off, left to wither on the vine. Japan's supply lines to the south were gone, and that cleared the way for the all-important invasion of Saipan. Why was Saipan so important? Because from there, American B-29 bombers were finally in range of Tokyo. This one operation dramatically sped up the end of the war. And what's wild to think about is what's become of this place. Today, Truk Lagoon, now called Truk Lagoon, is one of the world's most famous diving destinations. That ghost fleet, sunk in the fury of 1944, now forms a silent underwater museum, a haunting testament to the battle that was fought there. So, I'll leave you with this thought. A whole fleet of ships and supplies rests at the bottom of that lagoon. But what if it didn't? How different would the great naval battles of 1944 have been if the Japanese Navy had all those ships, all those supplies, and all that fuel? It's a pretty stark reminder of how one perfectly executed operation, a reverse Pearl Harbor, can truly change the course of history.